Hello and welcome to this video on producer surplus. My year 12 students were considering the whole notion of producer surplus this morning, and I thought what better to do than to put together a short video. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's get to it. So let me begin to add some text to the whiteboard. Producer surplus. So what do we need to know, or rather, what do you need to know about producer surplus? Well, I think the first thing you need to know is that whenever we're considering producer surplus, we're talking primarily about firms, and it comes under the heading and the topic material of supply. And if you're asked in an exam, or a multiple choice more specifically, to identify the area of producer surplus, then you're always really looking for the area above supply and below price. Okay, so if you can remember that, get that learned word for word. And if you can identify that on a diagram, then you shouldn't go too far wrong. Above supply and below price. But what do we really mean by producer surplus? Well, it's a surplus payment, so that implies that there's some sort of payment over and above the minimum required. And indeed, that is the case. So this is about a payment received by firms, which is over and above the bare minimum that they require to do what? To produce a given good or service. So if we put all of that together, we can come up with a definition for producer surplus, which will be something along the lines of a payment which is over and above the minimum required by a firm to supply a good or service. So I'll jot that down if you wish. So a payment over and above the minimum payment required to bring a good or service to the market. Okay. If you're looking at this whole notion of producer surplus, you've probably come across consumer surplus. So it's a very similar concept, although obviously you wouldn't want to mistake the two in an exam. So let's then get to some sort of diagrammatic analysis here, ladies and gentlemen, as to what we actually mean. So let me get some axes drawn. So we will have price, obviously, on our y-axis and quantity supplied on the x-axis. And we'll have our supply curve just as normal, really, S1. And we want to just indicate a specific price point. So in this instance, P1 and Q1. And if we just look back at what we said, area above supply, so we can see here, this golden rule, if you will, above supply and below price, then that would mean that in this instance, we're looking at this specific triangle. So that would be our producer surplus, because that is the area above the supply curve and below price. Now, what if there's a change in price? What then happens? We always deal with these sort of what if statements, don't we? So let's have a look on a separate diagram as to what would happen if there was an increase in price. So again, supply curve is normal, P and Q, price and quantity. Normally in the exam, obviously, you would write these out in full. For speed, I'm just abbreviating. So we've got P1, Q1, and then we're moving up P2 and Q2. Always really good practice, ladies and gents, to put your direction of travel here. And also make sure that you label P1, P2 and Q1, Q2 corresponding in the correct fashion. In other words, you don't have P2 corresponding with Q1 and P1 corresponding with Q2. So it just keeps you right. So we're going up P1 to P2 and we're going up Q1 to Q2. So I'm just going to add 3 labels here, A, B, and C. Now, in the exam, where you asked in the exam to identify producer surplus, more than likely you'd be asked maybe to identify the change in the producer surplus. Said consumer surplus there. So let's just have a think about where those areas might actually be. So what we want to identify is the original PS, producer surplus. Now we can see that is P1, Q1, and so we're talking this triangle, again, area above supply and below price. So it's, if we go back to our text here, so in terms of actually labeling, we'd be looking at a label of P1AC. So that's our original producer surplus. So what about the new PS, producer surplus? Well, the new price is P2, the new quantity is Q2, and remember, it's again above supply, below price, and so it's that entire triangle. So we're looking at P2BC for that one. P2BC. And then finally, what about the change? So in this instance, we have an increase, and the increase is from P1 up to P2. So the area of producer surplus is obviously P1, P2, BA, P1, P2, BA. And you need to get into the habit, ladies and gentlemen, of drawing your diagrams and then having that sort of analysis alongside of it. So I hope you found that useful, and I'm going to leave it at that. Bye for now.